I mean, you're the kind of digital humanities crowd, and it's nice to see a few familiar names and faces. Some of you might recognize the title. This was a rather impassioned speech that Deb Verhoeven gave at the 2015 Digital Humanities Conference in Sydney, when she was extremely annoyed, completely understandably, that, you know, all of the plenary speakers were men, and thought, you know, how is this possible in 2015 in Australia? So I've kind of taken, borrowed from her title to think about, has anyone cited a woman? I'm sure you all have, but have we all cited enough women, and what would be enough, and how would we know that? So this is beginning to be a bit more of a topic also in, obviously, amongst feminists, other kinds of activists, and also increasingly, I think, amongst scientometricians and bibliometricians. This is what I want to kind of talk about today, sort of how I kind of started doing this, and a few things which I'm sure, you know, you've all got university educations. Somebody probably taught you at some point about citation, but to kind of reflect on that, to think about citation as both a personal and as a political practice, quite some questions about measurement, and kind of where do we go from here. The picture you see, these kind of nice people, is one of the things that came out of my little project. We produced a nice guide. Here you can see it live. It's a very short guide about which we produced together with the feminist group at Maastricht University, where I work. So the backstory. Now, actually pre-corona, so I really don't know what my excuse was. My own background is in science and technology studies. And as Vicky mentioned, I mean, I do also work about digital technologies in healthcare, currently working on a project around AI and clinical decision-making, together with Andrea, who I can see smiling at me, which is very nice. We worked at this e-humanities group that Vicky mentioned for many years. So I've also done some work around what digital technologies mean for the humanities and the social sciences. For some reason, I decided in I think this autumn of 2019, when actually I was extraordinarily busy at work, but I decided I would look at the papers of my science and technology studies colleagues. That's what Maastricht University STS stands for. We get together once a year to kind of discuss drafts of papers. This was usually in the autumn. It was a couple of weeks ago. And I decided to look at their papers to see how often they cited men and women. Anyway, this is the result. Again, you can see this live. This is it. There were several drafts, just like with writing a paper. I knitted several versions of this. You know, no real prizes for guessing that orange is women, dark green is men, light green is men's citations to themselves. My women colleagues didn't seem to go in for self-citation. And the little baubles that you can see are citations to other colleagues. Male colleagues are green, and then there's one orange bauble, which wasn't to me, unfortunately. But so this was a kind of experiment in sort of representation, visualization of data, you could think of it as. And I know I've shown this to Andrea in the past. I think she was quite amazed. Some of my colleagues in Maastricht thought I'd completely lost the plot. Anyway, when lockdown started, so this was 6 months or so before Corona hit. When lockdown started, or around that time, I was reading this very interesting book, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I think Lauren Klein is a digital humanities person, called Data Feminism. And I'll be talking more about that a bit later on. And as I say, we have this group in Maastricht called Female Empowerment, with a rather unfortunate abbreviation of FEM, but okay. And I'm on their mailing list, and they're okay, it's lockdown, what are we going to do? And they'd organized a number of sort of a bit like this, some lunchtime sessions. And I suggested I could perhaps do something around this book, because not so much the very interesting and important stuff they write about data feminism, but actually about their appendix, in which they talk about aspirational metrics, where they try to hold themselves accountable for, as good feminists, citing women, citing people of color and things like that. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So the femme people said, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, come along. And we had a very good turnout from across the university. So people from very different faculties and academic backgrounds, and people from the library, which is also very nice. And on this slide, you can see down in the lower corner, there's holding ourselves accountable. That was the announcement for this event that was in February 2020. No, February 2021, sorry. And as a result of this, I was quite proud, my knitting appeared in Science Guide, which is the Dutch equivalent of the Times Higher Educational Supplement, or the Higher, or whatever, should we all have them. So we were interviewed by one of their journalists, and as I say, they included a photo of my knitting. And then the chair of the FEM group, who's a mathematical biologist, she suggests, well, there's clearly a lot of interest in this. Let's try and follow it up. So together with a few other women from across the faculty, and I include all of their names at the end, we produced this citation guide. And what we wanted to, we thought of this as just a very local thing, for the university, and we divided it up, what is trying to think about citational justice, what does that mean for students? What does it mean for us as teachers? What does it mean for us as writers, as editors, as peer reviewers? And there are a few kind of suggestions in that, which I'll mention. And after it was published, there was a surprising amount of interest in it. And we also produced a short piece for the LSE Impact Guide. That's the aspirational metrics. And as a result, we've been invited kind of individually and collectively to talk more about this. So let's go to kind of take a step back and think about why it is that we cite. And again, I'm sure, for this audience, most of this will be more than well known enough. I mean, partly it's to establish credibility for our own claims, to provide the reader with evidence and information, to acknowledge the work of others, the much cited, claim about standing on the shoulders of giants, to acknowledge who those giants are. And of course, I think very important to position oneself in the literature. And of course, for students in particular, is to protect yourself against charges of plagiarism. So I think there are lots and lots of reasons that we cite. It's something that we all learn very early on as students and in our academic careers. So these are some of the things that we said in the guide, as I was just mentioning. One of the things we wanted to do was to stimulate more discussion about citation practices. One of the things that came up amongst my group of authors of this, and also in the discussion that we held, is that we found that students, even if they knew the first name and the person was a woman and it was standing in front of them, they would often use male pronouns to talk about authors. That was their default. They still thought of authors as men, even if there was all sorts of evidence to the contrary. So we wanted to kind of get students to think about that, and also to, as teachers, to try and help students to think about that. And also as teachers to help ourselves think about who do we include on reference lists in our course material. One of the other things we wanted to think about was, as authors, about the choice of citation style. Because I'm sure many of you, if you work across disciplines, which probably in digital humanities you do, you'll notice that, you know, computer scientists use the, in my view, kind of very awkward, you know, sequential numbering system, the Vancouver style. Many people in the humanities use Chicago or MLA. And these citation styles themselves have consequences. So, you know, in Chicago, you have the choice of including the first name of somebody or not. In APA, which is widely used in the social sciences, you only put the initial. So when I came to do my bit of knitting, okay, luckily it was my field. I knew lots of the authors, but depending on the citation style that my colleagues were using for whatever reason, sometimes, you know, I did have to do a bit of detective work to try and identify the gender, which of course is not always straightforward anyway, because of, you know, different cultures, different naming traditions, different, yeah, it is sometimes rather difficult to assign gender with a degree of confidence, which makes achieving citational justice also a bit difficult. So yeah, I already mentioned teachers, and as reviewers and editors, I don't know, some of you may have noticed sort of recently, some journals are including a diversity statement when it comes to your reference list. And interestingly, I think I've seen more of this in sort of biology and chemistry than I have in the humanities and the social sciences. And I think this is something else I've kind of noticed in the past, that sometimes in the humanities and the social sciences, we're extremely good at theorizing about diversity and inclusion, but actually our colleagues in the natural sciences and engineering and computer scientists are actually much better at just doing it and getting on with it. But that's perhaps something for discussion. So to now take a step back to some more kind of theoretical and political points, and it's just kind of suggesting, you know, what I'm trying to kind of suggest, and I'm certainly not alone in this, is that, you know, just as many personal as political things, citation, you know, reproductive rights is a feminist issue, so is citation, the feminist issue. And Sarah Ahmed, in her book from 6-7 years ago now, Living a Feminist Life, has this nice quote. She wants to create a crisis around citation, or even just a hesitation, a wondering that might help us not to follow the well-trodden citational paths. So, okay, a hesitation is very different from a crisis, but I think, you know, a general kind of you know, call to kind of, for all of us to think about who are we citing and why. And I think, you know, especially as you get older, speaking as an older person, you know, it's very easy to cite the things that you're familiar with, that you've known for a long time. But sometimes I think for us older people, it's good to think about, okay, who are we citing and why? And is there anything new here we could cite? And so, yeah, this is the kind of reason that we wanted to do this. More recently, Cassidy Sugimoto was quoted in an article in Nature earlier this year, talking about, it was an article about citational justice, as the title suggests. And as she says, it isn't only about justice, because, you know, it's also about doing robust, rigorous science. You know, whether you're really exploring, you know, everything there is to be explored. And I think, again, something that we said in the guide that, just making sure that your citation practices are a bit more balanced across different sorts of measures isn't actually the solution to lower pay, the fact that there are fewer women professors. I mean, it depends where you live. In the Netherlands, of course, it's a lot better than it used to be, but it's still, in terms of full professors in the Netherlands, about 22% of full professors are women. So yeah, getting our citations right isn't going to solve the structural problems, but it's better than nothing. And I think there is a relationship between the structural problems and citations, because often, despite, in the Netherlands, there are attempts to move away from this, also internationally with the Leiden Manifesto and the San Francisco Declaration, also attempts to move away from metrics that never really applied to the humanities anyway. But nonetheless, citation counts often are taken into account when it comes to making decisions about appointing new staff, about promoting people. So citational justice, I think, has many different sorts of dimensions. It's important to think about. So Aurélie and I gave a presentation actually to a group of scientometricians earlier this year, and there was a woman present at that who later sent me this article she'd written, Lai Ma, which I very, very interesting. She says, I think quite rightly, that the reasons that works of women and ethnic minorities are read less and cited less can be due to the perceptions of quality based on systemic and unconscious biases, or even outright discrimination. That if you see somebody's name and you think it's a woman, or you think it's, non-Western person, non-European, non-American, and you think, oh, I'm not going to read that. So it could be a sort of form of unconscious bias, could just be you don't like women. But she kind of talks also about that and what it means, how we kind of measure this, how we can deal with this. So as I say, there is some kind of growing attention for this in the literature across the disciplines. But it is really, really difficult to measure. And I'm sure there are people present who understand this much better. And it's also important to remember that there are huge variations between kind of fields about what constitutes an adequate number of references, about self-citation norms, citation styles. There are lots and lots of differences. So, it's not like, I'm sure we've all had the experience of students asking us, well, how many references should I include in this paper? And we all try and be patient and answer them patiently. And there is no easy answer. And I think it gets even more difficult if you think, what would be the optimal number of references to women or racialized minorities in a paper? With philosophy, that amongst the humanities remains the most male-dominated, and obviously a discipline with a very, very long history, which for all sorts of obvious historical and structural reasons has been dominated by men. To suddenly say that a philosophy paper published in 2022 should have 50% references to women, I'm not sure that would be doing justice to the history of philosophy, for example. So it is kind of difficult to measure. All of these numbers should be treated incredibly carefully, and my apologies. This was the one bit of the, well, I did actually prepare this last week when I was healthy, and I had a note to myself, update slides on numbers, but I'm afraid I didn't quite get around to that this morning. And this is a bit old, but nonetheless, I think it, gives a sort of interesting kind of, indication of the huge differences between disciplines. And I think, the lowest at the top, the health professionals, I think the professional disciplines or the practice-based disciplines, probably not only in health sciences, but probably in other areas, probably cite less than social sciences, arts and humanities. But even in the social sciences and humanities, I think there are differences between fields that, you know, I don't know if you've ever read anything by a psychologist, but they can't seem to get through a sentence without 5 references. Historians obviously cite a lot, but some of those are sources, some of those are, you know, other literature, other academic literature. So, you know, there's lots and lots of reasons why there might be differences. So, as I say, you really have to think carefully about how one would measure this, also to see if, you know, what your own metric should be, and also to think about what would be a kind of good, just number for the references to people who have been historically excluded from universities. Again, it's not so old. A few years ago, there was another interesting piece that also tried to make the link between kind of citation practices and kind of structural inequalities in terms of promotion, tenure and promotion, and, you know, refers to philosophy. Again, I think particularly in the case of philosophy, we'd have to think hard about what would be a good number here. But again, apologies to the men in the room, but it does seem to be that men are more prone to self-citation than women. And in the very first discussion I had about this in Maastricht, we had a long discussion about this, about, you know, what is the balance between, you know, self-citation and, you know, making reference to your previous arguments and acknowledging the development of your own work, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and beating your own drum, which, you know, may be less legitimate. And again, it gets really, really difficult in the life sciences and other kind of natural sciences where the norm is multiple authorship. Because then how do you, again, how would you count this? So I've seen a few recent articles, and one is mentioned here. This is for the life science medical journals, where they, you know, tried to account for this by looking at, you know, the first author and the last author, which are the particularly important ones in the medical and life sciences. The first one did most of the work, and the last one got the money. So, you know, people who are now trying to kind of look at this and, you know, look at all the possible combinations, you know, first and last both women, first and last both men, first woman, last man. I mean, you can imagine. So, I mean, measurement issues are really, really tricky here. That's the kind of point I'm trying to make. So what can we do about this? And I think, you know, the other thing I definitely want to acknowledge is the problem of intersectionality. I mean, it's, you know, focus so far has been on those of us who identify as women. But of course, you know, there are many other issues that are important when we talk about structural inequalities and invisibilities in, well, in academia, and knowledge production is our major concern at the moment. And of course, this is something that, you know, second wave feminists were aware of. Didn't always handle very well, but speaking as a second wave feminist, but nonetheless, you know, how do we try and take account of the differences? And, you know, while it's, as I already kind of hinted at in the beginning, it can be very difficult to try and identify with certainty whether someone identifies as male or female. It's really, really difficult to identify whether someone is an ethnic minority, whether what somebody's sexuality is, just from a name on a paper. So in order to kind of, you know, do the kind of measurement work that I was suggesting might need to be done, I think would be very hard work. I mean, one suggestion I have heard is that, you know, people can start including these statements in, you know, we have our acknowledgement in a paper, acknowledgements, ethics statements, research data management, you know, author identity. It's not going to help us historically, but could be interesting. So to go back to the Data Feminism book, so what Klein and sorry, I've forgotten the name, D'Ignazio did that I found so interesting was that, they are, very self-avowed feminists, intersectionality, anti-racist, and they wanted to hold themselves accountable. So, early on in their process of writing the book, they set themselves what they call these aspirational metrics. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but so they identified the particular structural problem, their own metrics, what they achieved in the draft that they put on the net for open peer review, and what happened in the final kind of book version that was published by MIT Press. Now, what's interesting, I think it's an interesting exercise, and I'll mention a couple of other experiments like this a bit later on. What I find interesting about this, and very honest of them, is that sometimes the numbers went down between the open peer review and what finally got published. And they talk a little bit about kind of how that happened, but and also, one of the things they also kind of acknowledge in the book is, these are two women who work at elite American institutions, I think one at MIT and one at Yale. They themselves were trained in a very elite system, so, have the same problem that I mentioned earlier, how do you, they probably read a lot of white men when they were studying themselves, so you have to make an effort to kind of broaden your own kind of knowledge base. As I said, I'm not quite sure how they actually measured some of these things. You'd have to work very hard. So this was the first set. This is the second set. Some of these are, fairly self-evident about kind of how it worked out. One thing I would say, okay, they do have a structural problem of colonialism. What they don't mention is US centrism, which, no offense to any Americans present, is something one sees more often with American colleagues. And I think I haven't gone round to counting or knitting yet, but I think their book is quite US centric. But nonetheless, I think this is a kind of really admirable thing to try and do. So the other example I came across very recently, that was published last year, a book by Max Liboron, who's a Canadian scholar, in a book called Making and Doing. It's a science and technology studies book. And actually, there's a marine biologist, does lots of interesting work about plastics in oceans and how we can reduce this and how we measure this. But also, works a lot at the intersection of marine biology and science and technology studies. So they wrote this chapter called Doing Ethics with Cod, and they mean the fish. So they did a different kind of experiment. They did not order their citations alphabetically, but according to who they felt they had learned the most from. And I thought, God, I'd love to have been part of those discussions. How did they decide who they owed the most? And of course, they live in Canada, on Newfoundland, and I think at least one of these people is Indigenous. So, where there's a tradition of, you feed your elders and your teachers first. So you acknowledge these people first. Now, what I've heard, because I know both of the editors of this book quite well, and they had a real problem with the publisher doing this, because we've all published stuff. Publishers have house styles. This was so against the house style. They kept wanting to order it alphabetically. Okay, they didn't have much to say about the fact that they also only cited women or non-binary people, but the fact that they ordered it non-alphabetically, wanted to give first names, came as a bit of a surprise to MIT Press. And then right at the very end, they do have the entry, which is white, comma, men, all of history. So anyway, but they also talk about this in the chapter. I mean, most of the chapter is about marine biology and measuring plastics in the oceans, but they do include 2 short reflections on their citation practices and their ordering of their author names, but that's a different story and I won't talk about that here. Another thing that we're doing in Maastricht, I mean, I'm not directly part of this, but Sharon Anyango, one of the co-authors of our guide, got a small pot of money from the diversity group of the university to kind of develop it further, to think about tools that can be used to facilitate, students talking about citation bias. That's still ongoing, but I think it's an interesting way of taking this further in education. Right, so my voice is just about holding up, and this is more or less my last slide. So I think there are different ways of thinking about citational justice and citational bias. I think personally, we can think about how we cite, who we cite, how do we represent it. I mean, I now try and at least include first names when I'm citing and not only initials, partly to kind of make visible the contributions of women a bit more. But also I think there's lots of work to be done about what do we mean by citational justice and how do we measure it and how do we know when we've achieved it. And then the big question, which I've also kind of alluded to, is, what's the link between citation and the kind of structural problems and the use of metrics in evaluations, both of individuals, research groups, universities, and what we all think about citation diversity statements, which as they have begun to see more of in the past year or two. So I will, these are the people who I worked with to produce the guide, but I'll go back perhaps to this set of questions, but maybe I will stop screen sharing. But yes, I will stop here and look forward to your comments and questions and what has appeared in the chat, so thank you.